Hi, this is Emily. I'm a tech editor at fiatfiberarts.com, and I'm going to talk today about stitch counts. Stitch counts is some very important information that needs to be in crochet patterns. It's at the end of every line of instruction, and we're going to talk today about what exactly you need to write and how to write it for a variety of different options. Now, when I evaluate a pattern, and when you write a pattern as a designer, the person that I have in mind and the person that I want you to keep in mind for writing your pattern is someone who's doing this particular item for the very first time. Imagine that they have the skills needed to do the pattern, but they've never actually done that kind of thing before. So they may be learning a new stitch, they may be learning a new technique, they may just be applying the same information that they had in a different way on this new design. So that's the kind of person that we're thinking about, someone who's doing this for the very first time, and we want to be absolutely clear when we're giving the instructions so that that person can do it without having too many questions. Now, what is the stitch count? The stitch count at the end of the row or round tells the person how many of what type of stitch they just completed. It may seem kind of redundant, but it's still pretty helpful. So in a pattern where maybe they're just doing single crochet all across the row, and you already told them to chain out 157, and they single crochet in the second chain from the hook and in each chain across, well, then they have 156 stitches, and you'd think that kind of math is pretty simple. But we just want to make sure, for the first time, the first person doing it, make sure they have the right number of stitches. Tell them what they made. It's sort of the basic setup for giving a presentation. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Okay? So we're kind of giving the middle information. We're telling them what to do, and then at the end of the line, we're telling them what we told them. Now, I'm going to be using this pattern as an example because it's got a good variety of stitches and stitch types in it. This is the Lost in Time shawl by Joanna Lindahl. I hope I'm saying that name right, Joanna Lindahl, at Miho Crochet website, and it is really a fantastic pattern if you want to try different things and different techniques. But what's important about it is that as you do each row, you have to make sure that the stitch counts are accurate so that you're setting up for the following row where it may play a more vital role. Now, what to write when you write a stitch count? You want to be writing the total number of each type of stitch that was performed in that line. So if they did a variety of single crochets and double crochets or triples or chains, you want to have each type of that listed. Now you may think, if I have a really crazy pattern, that is going to get insane. I really don't want to be adding up all those different things. Can't I just tell them how to do it and expect that they do it right? Well, you can, but remember, think about that person who's doing it for the first time. When they get to the end of that line, do you want them to check then to make sure that they did it correctly? Or do you want them to have to wait until they're like 2 or 3 rows later and they made a mistake 3 rows back and now they're mad at themselves and they're mad at your pattern and they don't want to do it and they might not come back to your website? We don't really want that to happen. We want them to be happy. We want them to get it done and get accomplished and feel all those wonderful feelings that we get from crochet. So we want to have that information there for them. Now, when should you write it? You should write the stitch count and put it at the end of a line when the stitch count changes. So if you've increased or decreased in number of stitches, you would want to add it. If you've changed the type of stitch that you've done, you may add it or not add it. It's kind of up to you at that point, and I'm talking about things where maybe there's a row difference. If you have, say, single crochet on one row and double crochet on the next row, but there's no difference in the number of stitches, I would put that information down for maybe 2 rows. Say single crochet, this one, there's 150 of them, and the next row is all double crochet, 150 double crochet. But after that, if you just repeat those 2 rows over and over, you don't really have to keep writing it. In fact, you don't need to keep writing those rows if it's really a repeat. You would just say repeat previous 2 rows until whenever, or this many times, or whatever your pattern is. If the exact same thing is happening more than twice, use a repeat function. Don't, if we write it all out, then we're getting a little long on the eyes and your reader gets kind of annoyed. And it gets confusing. So that's why we use repeats. That's a whole other story, a different blog post. So what to write or when to write it is when it changes. If you have increases or decreases or the stitch type changes, go ahead and put a new stitch count in. Now, how to write it is where a lot of designers sometimes get confused. We know it goes at the end of the row, but we want it to look different from our regular instructions. We don't want the person to get to the end of the row and see 10 DC and think, I make another 10 double crochet. I just did 10 double crochet. They may be really confused if it looks similar to what they've already done as far as the instructions go. So you want the stitch count to look different and be clearly different from the rest of the instructions. Great ways to do that is to separate it from your instructions by a hyphen or a dash, or if you're writing in sentence structure form for your pattern, which means you have a capital letter at the beginning, you have commas between each step of the instructions. That means what to do in each stitch. You have commas between those, and one single period at the end of the line that clearly tells the person, here's the things you're supposed to do, period, end of story, end of instructions, and then the stitch count. It separates it completely. I would still alter the font or the text of that stitch count in a little way to make it extra clear that that is not instructions. So my favorite ways of doing that is to use bold font or to enclose your stitch count in the greater than, less than symbols. All right, the open, close, greater, less than, triangle symbols. Those are the best. And why are they the best? Because we don't use them in crochet writing. We just don't. Unless you had a really complex pattern, you're just not going to be using those symbols. So it's clearly something different. Another great thing about the greater than, less than symbols is if you have multiple sizes. A lot of designers will put their stitch count in parentheses. But what if you had more sizes in a pattern? And you were writing your pattern for small and then had medium and large or any other sizes inside parentheses. At the end of the line, if you run all of them together inside one set of parentheses, the person's eye may be confused about which number to look at for their particular size. When they were doing the pattern, say they were doing size medium, they're always looking at the first number after the open parenthesis. When they get to the stitch count, now they have to pay attention to the second number after the parenthesis. And that may be a little confusing. Any kind of confusion in your pattern is not a great thing for your reader. So we want to eliminate every possible little tiny bit of confusion that we can. Now, don't take that too far to an extreme. We'll get there, don't worry. So I still like the open, close, greater than, less than symbols because you can have those and then have your small, open parentheses, medium, large, close parentheses, stitch type, close the greater than, less than. And everything in the parentheses looks exactly the same way as what they've been accustomed to reading throughout the pattern. So it really helps it to be easier on the eyes. You're training the reader to read your pattern in a certain way, and it's just easier to keep that training the same from looking at one part of your pattern to the next. So you could also put it in italics if you want to. and just have a hyphen and then the stitch count. But if there isn't something sort of enclosing the stitch count or making it really clear, like if you use bold font, you could just have period, end of your line, hyphen, and then bold, hyphen, and the total stitch count, 10 single crochet, 10 double crochet, whatever it is. And when it's in bold, it's clearly not instructions. So you don't need to have it enclosed in anything in addition to the bold font. But if you want to keep everything the same type of font, I would have period, hyphen, greater than, less than, the open one. and then all of your stitch count information, and then the closing triangle, the triangles, okay? So that's what I would, that's really my favorite way. But you can do it other ways if you wish. But this is about how to write stitch counts, and that's what I'm recommending is greater than, less than symbols or bold font. Now, so we talked about stitch counts for multiple sizes. I'm looking at my blog post while I'm doing this. All right, so let's talk about stitch counts in patterns, and that's where the shawl is really going to come into play. So you can see for a few rows here, there's double crochet, chain one, skip one, double crochet. So that's a pretty easy pattern to write up. She's going to have the beginning part of the pattern a little different up here when she gets started on it. And then we have in parentheses or with an asterisk our repeat of double crochet in the next stitch, chain one, skip one, repeat. And it's going to go all the way down to the middle. And so it's repeat to center stitch, center chain two stitch, marker. If you put a marker in the center stitch, it's a real great way to just say repeat to the marker. Then you're going to have the information there, and then you're going to have possibly the same, possibly a different kind of repeat going up to the other end. Now, at the end of that, the person wants to make sure that they have the correct number of stitches and spaces. So you would count up how many double crochets there are and what to do about these chain spaces. Now, if it's only one type of space throughout the pattern, you could just call it chain space, and that's CH-SP. With a hyphen makes it a noun. They're counting a thing, and that is the space. So, or you could have CH-1 SP for chain one space, because there may be chain one spaces and then there's going to be perhaps a chain two space in the middle. Just one, but it's still there and it's different from all the others. So you'll have the double crochets, the chain one spaces. If anything different happens at the ends, you would have that information, and that's what you need. The following row would be single crochets, and then you repeat those rows, but each time you repeat it, it's increasing, so it would be a good idea to have the final count at the end of the last repeat of that type. So the final row after here, you would have a stitch count. Now, what's happening next on this pattern is we have popcorn stitches and then double crochets in between and some chain loops. So this is another one. You just start to count whatever's set up in the repeat, the popcorns, the double crochet, and the chain spaces in between. When we, in between those, between there and the next big decorative piece on this pattern, are some larger chain loops that happen. Now, sometimes you can call it loops, sometimes you can call it spaces. Verbally and giving instruction, I kind of flip back and forth between what I'm saying, but when you're writing it, you really want to be consistent about how you're referencing the thing in your pattern. So as far as chain spaces or chain loops, pick one of those terminology and stick with it. So here's the thing with chains. I wouldn't count how many chains they did, or the chains plus the single crochet or whatever that like attached it to the spot. You know, with this one, it looks almost like they were V-stitches, but quite large V-stitches, and the V-stitch was a double crochet, a chain two or chain three, and then another double crochet. If you define that type of stitch and you name it in your pattern, that's the way you count it. So let me say that again. If you define a stitch, like say this V stitch that is a double crochet, chain 2, double crochet, count it as a V stitch. Don't add up at the end how many double crochets they have and how many chains they have up here. Count it as one V stitch. That's the way they're going to be counting it on their pattern. So that's the thing with V stitches or popcorns. Don't count all the little things inside. Count the whole popcorn as one item and count those along the way. When it comes to shells, like here, see, they worked a certain number of double crochets in that V stitch all the way down for this particular row. At the end of the row, count the shells. Make it easy on your reader. Don't count each individual double crochet in each of these. You told them how many double crochet to put in each shell, but the shell is the thing that we're counting. So that's what's at the end of the row. And then it just goes on from there with the popcorns being created and then post stitches and other types of things. So I really hope that helps with some of the stitch count questions that you might be having. What do I write? How do I write it? Bold, greater than, less than symbols are fantastic. You can maintain all your same writing styles if you use those. Also, write what you did when it changes from the previous row. And write things as easy as it possibly can be for your reader to count it. If you have a bunch of chain spaces or a bunch of chain loops, maybe there's a bunch of chain 5 loops that go across or chain 7 loops. Count it as a single thing. Don't count all the chains that made up every single loop. So with that, I want to leave you with some information about my website. Go ahead and check out fiatfiberarts.com and you can see more on this blog post and others about how to write crochet, and send me an email or catch me on Instagram. I would love to chat with you and let me know if you have any questions about stitch counts or any other aspect about writing crochet. Thank you so much.